Audio Jungle.
Kirko walked into the office with an odd sense of unfamiliarity. The desks, chairs, and his favorite snack cabinet were right where they had been 2 months ago when he left for his research assignment, but still, something felt different. He reflected briefly on the thought that maybe he was the one that was different now, but he quickly pushed that idea to the back of his mind when Sharka hovered up to him. "Hey Kirko. It feels like ages since I last saw you here. Did your trip go well?" she said with a broad smile, looking up towards him from her chair. "Nice to see you too, Sharka," he said, before hurrying around her towards the snack cabinet. He reached in and found a container of Jiji juice which he immediately pierced the seal on. The sweet aroma of Jiji berries filled his nostril as he savored a long gulp. "Ah, I haven't had one of these in months. You can't believe how much I've missed them. Clearly more than you've missed me," Sharka said jokingly as she maneuvered her chair around and drove towards him. "Do the humans not have decent food on their planets?" He swallowed another mouthful before answering. "Oh, it's okay I guess. They've got some really nice fruits, but most things were too salty for my taste. Anyway, you won't believe the things I've seen these past months. I have a mountain's worth of notes to compile. Well, there is still some time left before the morning meeting. Do you want to share the juicy parts?" Sharka asked, clearly hoping he would. "It's hard to choose where to begin," he said, playing with the seal on his drink. "I guess the thing I will focus on in my report is their interaction with tools. You see, at a first glance they are not that different from any other sapient species in the galaxy. Nothing spectacular appearance-wise, compatible psychology and culture, no shocking new technologies. Pretty much what you would expect from a species in their second phase of interstellar colonization." He paused to dig through the cabinet for something to eat before the meeting. "Well, that's what I've heard too," Sharka said, signaling for him to hand her a Nug Bar as well, "but I also encountered some strange rumors about their spacecrafts. Is it true that they are manually piloted?" "Yes, that ties into what I was about to explain," he said while chewing on his bar. "I think the phenomenon can be traced to something strange with their brains. Their scientists called it plasticity or something. It doesn't translate well. Is their central nervous system made of synthetic carbon polymers? That does sound strange." "No, not like that," Kirko said, trying to swallow his snack. "I told you it doesn't translate. Basically, it means malleability or flexibility. Their brains can change based on new inputs." I'll admit that neuroscience isn't my area of expertise, but isn't that how every brain works? How else would we learn new things?" Sharka asked. She crumpled up the wrapper from her bar and threw it towards the recycling bin. It bounced on the edge before falling to the floor. She groaned loudly while driving her chair over to pick it up. She leaned carefully over the edge of her chair and fumbled around a bit before finding the wrapper and pointedly throwing it straight into the bin. Kirko had to fight the urge to go pick it up for her, but he knew that Sharka wouldn't let anyone baby her. Even after the loss of her legs, she seemed determined to remain independent. "Yeah, that's true," he said while walking over to the bin to toss his own wrapper. His anatomy wasn't suited for throwing things, but the humans seemed to be extra good at it, especially when it comes to sensory processing and motor skills. "That doesn't mean much to me," Sharka said while hovering back towards the snack cabinet. "What does that have to do with manually piloting spacecrafts?" "Well, I guess you could say that the spacecraft is a sort of tool to them." Kirko tapped his arm as he tried to think of a suitable comparison. "You know, when you have to learn to use a new tool, maybe for one of your metal crafting hobby projects, you learn how to hold it properly, what buttons to push for what effect and so on." Sharka nodded. She had bought more new tools for her hobby than she cared to admit. Handheld soldering lasers did not come cheap. Kirko continued. "A human would learn it about as fast as you would, but the difference is in how they master it. You see, they don't just memorize how to handle it. After a while their brains start actively helping them, making the use almost instinctual. Eventually, they don't even have to think about pushing the buttons, their bodies just do it automatically. When they think of what they want their tool to do, So, their brains just kind of skip a step for them? Sharka asked with a puzzled look. Yes, exactly. Kirko exclaimed, happy that she had grasped the concept despite his lackluster explanation. Their brains store the information about the tool as if it were a part of their own body. You don't have to think about what muscles to contract when you lift your hand, right? You just think that you want to lift it and then you do it. Well, they can do the same with tools. Huh, that's hard to imagine. Sharka said while examining her own hand. I don't think I've ever experienced something like that. That makes sense since neither of our species are capable of it, at least not after we reach maturity. You know, Sharka said with a thoughtful look. I think I remember my doctor saying something about that after my accident. She stared down at her thighs, where her legs ended in two short stumps. He said that if I had lost my legs when I was still a child, I could have gotten a pair of artificial legs instead. That my young brain could have learned how to move them as if they were my own, but that it would be impossible for me at this age. If I got them now, the artificial or regrown legs would need to be a perfect match to the original nerves and muscles, or they wouldn't connect properly with my brain. She seemed a bit down at the thought, but quickly perked up again. Do you think a human would be able to learn how to use new legs, even when fully grown? Oh, more than that, Kirko said enthusiastically. They could not only adapt to a new pair of legs, I've seen humans with artificial limbs that don't even match their species. Hang on a minute. He dug through his bag to find his datapad and unfolded it carefully. With a few touches he displayed the pictures from his trip and found the one he was searching for. Look here, he said and angled the datapad towards Sharka. Humans normally only have 4 limbs, 2 arms and 2 legs, but this scientist I met had a robotic prehensile tail for anchoring herself in zero-G environments. She had a brain implant that let her use the tail as if she had been born with it. Her brain had even formed new synaptic connections around the implant to better control the extra limb. She told me she felt naked without it, as if she had lost an arm. Wow. Sharka muttered as she examined the picture of the human woman with the clearly metallic 5th appendage attached to her back. She tried to imagine what it would feel like to control such a thing with her mind, but the concept was so foreign to her biology that she might as well imagine trying to taste a new color. Kirko continued without waiting for her reaction. They can do the same with non-attached tools too. You should see how they make music. It's like the instrument becomes a part of their own bodies. They use them as easily as we use our own voices. He really wished that he had thought of recording the musicians. He had seen at the shuttle station, but unfortunately, he had been too mesmerized by the sounds and movements to do much of anything before he had to hurry to not miss his shuttle. That must be way more impressive than the concerts I've been to. Sharka said, most modern musicians only need to push a few buttons to play the next song. Kirko hadn't gone on many concerts, but he nodded in agreement before continuing his rant. Dual use really comes easily to them. They even use tools just for eating. Can you imagine using 2 sticks to pick up a shill nut? Well, their kids have learned to do that as quickly as I could with my hands. He clicked a few times on his datapad to find the picture of a small human with black hair, in the process of eating a piece of food that it held between 2 sticks in one hand. Well, that's just weird, Sharka said as she studied the picture. I assume they have proper sanitation. So why would they not just eat with their hands? It seems so much easier. That's true, said Kirko, unable to refute her logic. But I've seen cooler things than sticks. They don't just have extra limbs and tools, they can even learn new senses. He paused dramatically for a moment to observe Sharka's reaction to this amazing revelation, but she just stared blankly at him, like she often did when he had told an unusually bad joke. He shook off his disappointment and reminded himself of the story he had heard from a human xenologist colleague. Before they perfected Bionic Eyes, some humans who lost their sight learned how to use echolocation. Their species has worse hearing than most, but some were still able to learn how to pick up and process quiet sound waves bouncing off objects. Most humans can't even hear sounds like that, but the brains of those blind people adapted to use areas previously used for visual information to process auditory input instead. They organically rewired themselves to make room for a new sense. Incredible, Sharka said, her antennae twitching. So, can they learn to use any of the known senses? What about magnetic fields? Electromagnetic waves outside the normal visual spectrum. Airborne phenomenal communication. Well, I don't know for certain. Kirko tried to shield himself a bit from her enthusiasm as he leaned back against the cabinet. But if I have understood the process correctly, then if you take a tool that gathers that information and link it to a sense they already have, sight, touch or something like that, then they can learn how to interpret that new information as a new sense. So not just seeing data about the magnetic field, but actually feeling it. That's amazing. Imagine how useful that could be when navigating. I know the Ryugen have a sense like that, but to give it to someone that wasn't born with it. Incredible. Sharka seemed completely amazed at the prospect, and Kirko laughed. I guessed you would feel like that. Of course a pilot would focus on navigational applications, instead of, say, seeing body heat to interpret someone's mood. I'll leave the sociological applications to you, Kirko. Sharka said while almost bouncing in her chair. But tell me. Spacecrafts. Do you mean that the humans see them as a tool? Exactly. Kirko was relieved that Sharka seemed to understand his explanations. That was a good sign for the report he had to write. They use computers for navigation and most of the maneuvering, especially for big crafts and long voyages, but for detailed maneuvers such as takeoff and landing, they prefer to have hands on the controls. It's as if they trust their own hands over a specialized AI. Kind of crazy if you ask me. Who would dare put a fallible organic being in charge of a huge metal death trap? He tapered off into silence as he looked at Sharka to see if he had stirred up any bad memories, but she didn't seem to have lost her enthusiasm. She said, I can see what you mean with that. They must be very confident in their own abilities if they prefer to steer the craft themselves. Frankly, I think there is more to it than that. He said while remembering some of the odder parts of his trip. I think they do it for fun. When I visited Centauri B, they held several competitions in small craft racing. Maneuvering a small flying craft along a predetermined route as fast as possible with obstacles and turns everywhere. No AI steering allowed. It was quite a sight to behold. I couldn't believe that it wasn't pre-programmed drones. Until I saw the view from the inside cameras. This was the part he really wished that Sharka had been there for. He knew she had loved piloting simulations for her previous job in calibrating flight AIs. You should have seen the pilot. He treated the craft the same way they treat smaller tools. He didn't need to think about how he should move his hand to steer, he just steered. It's hard to explain, but it really seemed like he and the craft were the same object, or maybe like the craft was an extension of himself. Like a giant exoskeleton with flight capabilities. He shuddered a bit at the thought. Some things just were not meant to be. Oh, wow. Sharka shared his discomfort at the idea. I know I would be able to steer a spacecraft in case of a serious malfunction, but to do it for fun, with lives on the line. There is no way that that sport would be allowed on any other species' planets. Frankly, I'll be surprised if they will even allow humans to manually dock at our spaceports. Kirko laughed uncomfortably as he remembered his trips in human spacecrafts. Leaving his life in the hands of a stranger had been nerve-wracking, despite the ride being as smooth as the best AI-piloted shuttle he had even been on. Do you think they could go further? Sharka asked thoughtfully. Feed all the information from the craft into their brains like a new sense, I mean. Again, Kirko physically shuddered at the idea. Well, if they can't do it now, they will probably be able to do it soon after they gain access to the Galactic Databank and its information on cybernetic enhancements. We might not have had as much incentive to research the topic as them, but we've had much more time. He was simultaneously excited and worried at the prospect of seeing how humanity would make use of all the new technology in the galaxy. Their perspective was so different from others. Right, I heard that too. Sharka said. Something about how their technological advancements and interstellar expansion took much longer for them than for most others. But how does that make sense with all you've just told me about their superior tool use abilities? Kirko had put considerable thought into the topic, but was still not entirely sure he had completely understood it. From what I have seen, they have a near instinctual distrust for AI and advanced robotics. Many would be as uncomfortable with a fully AI-piloted craft as you would be with a manual one. Sharka nodded in understanding. The situation may be different, but she could definitely empathize with the discomfort. Kirko continued his explanation. Even during the beginnings of industrialization, many humans disliked the increased automation. I guess for most species in the galaxy, machines were a way of accomplishing tasks that were difficult or impossible to do manually. But to humans, machines were more like a superior replacement, taking over a task that humans were perfectly capable of performing by themselves. If a person can do a task only slightly worse than a machine, then automating that task becomes less necessary. It sounds like you're saying they were too good for their own good. Sharka laughed. Why wouldn't someone want to make their lives easier if they could? Why won't you get one of those voice-activated drones that can pick things off the floor for you? Kirko said, trying not to sound too harsh. Ugh. Sharka grimaced. You got me there. I guess human psychology isn't that far from our own after all. There is something special to doing a thing with your own hands, instead of always relying on assistance. I bet if you could control a spacecraft as if it were your own body, you would want to try that too. Yeah, probably. Sharka seemed to drift into her own thoughts for a moment. I'm not sure if it would feel better or worse if I could blame myself for the accident, instead of a malfunctioning AI and a distracted shuttle pilot. She thought about it for a moment longer before she grinned bitterly and said, probably worse. Kirko decided to change the subject and said with a sigh, I wish the customs control would have let me to bring some of that dried mango fruit the humans had. I think you would have liked it. Sweet and a tiny bit sour. Almost like overly ripe jasho. I wish customs control would have let you bring a human pilot. Sharka laughed. I would love to chat with one. Well, you should get a chance fairly soon. Kirko said while checking the time on his datapad. From what I saw, the preparations for integration are almost complete. Humanity will be a full member of the Galactic Cooperative within the year, and most humans I talked to seemed more than excited at the prospect of visiting other planets. You should see some of them here on Vin within the decade. With robotic tails and extra senses. I certainly hope so. If not, I will have to go see them myself. Kirko grabbed another Nug Bar before walking over to the meeting room with Sharka hovering behind him. He still had plenty of notes to compile, but at least now he knew for certain that humanity's unique way of using tools would be an excellent subject for his report. The author's name and the link to original text in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. And please join our channel. Thanks for watching.